Hi friends, welcome to one more set of 12 sets of 9 WH questions. That is the heading, and here we have written the 9 types of WH questions, and based upon then we have to add a sentence, and based upon this sentence we are going to ask all these questions: what, where, when, why, who, and all these questions. And when we frame these questions we have to answer according to these things. So now we are going to form a sentence over here. Now the verb that we are going to use is praise. P-R-A-I-S-E. Okay. Now we have used the word praise. We need to just form a sentence. Okay. Here we say disciples. Disciples praise God. So here we have a verb, here is the subject, and here is the object. So, disciples praise God. Now, based upon this sentence, we are going to ask these WH questions. Let me show you how. Now, the first one is, what do disciples do? Now the answer to that is the same answer. Disciples praise God. Next, we have where. Where do disciples praise God? Disciples praise God everywhere. Third one, when. When do disciples praise God? Answer, disciples praise God always. Fourth one, why. Why do disciples praise God? Disciples praise God for everything He has given them. Fifth one, who praise God? Answer, disciples praise God. Sixth one, for whose purpose do disciples praise God? Answer to that, disciples praise God for God's purpose. Seventh one, with whom do disciples praise God? Answer to that. Disciples praise God alone or at times with the family. Eighth one. Which God do disciples praise? Disciples praise the true God they believe in. Ninth, how do disciples praise God? Disciples praise God through prayers and singing hymns. So here we have a set of 9 WH questions, and here we have a set of 9 answers to these WH questions. Now don't worry about the technicality of those about God and disciples. We are just framing these sentences so that you will be able to answer them in a simple way. So this is the right way of framing WH questions, and this is the right way of answering to those WH questions. Now don't talk about the inner meanings. We are just worried about the tenses and how we ask WH questions and here how we answer those WH questions. Now let us read this first set. What do disciples do? Disciples praise God. Where do disciples praise God? Disciples praise God everywhere. It could be at home, it could be at the office, it could be near the park, anywhere. So disciples praise God. If you are a true disciple, you will definitely praise God everywhere and in everything. Next, when do disciples praise God? Disciples praise God always. Why do disciples praise God? Disciples praise God for everything He has given them. Who praise God? Disciples praise God. For whose purpose do disciples praise God? Disciples praise God for God's purpose. With whom do disciples praise God? Disciples praise God alone or at times with family members. Which God do disciples praise? Disciples praise the true God they believe in. How do disciples praise God? Disciples praise God through prayers and singing hymns. Now let's go to the second set. What did disciples do? Disciples praised God. Where did disciples praise God? Disciples praised God everywhere. When did disciples praise God? Disciples praised God always. Why did disciples praise God? Disciples praised God for everything He gave them. Who praised God? Disciples praised God. For whose purpose did disciples praise God? Disciples praised God for God's purpose. With whom did disciples praise God? Disciples praised God alone or at times with family members. Which God did disciples praise? Disciples praised the true God they believed in. How did disciples praise God? Disciples praised God through prayers or through singing hymns. Okay, let's go to the third set. What will disciples do? Disciples will praise God. Where will disciples praise God? Disciples will praise God everywhere. When will disciples praise God? Disciples will praise God always. Why will disciples praise God? Disciples will praise God for everything He will give them. Who will praise God? Disciples will praise God. For whose purpose will disciples praise God? Disciples will praise God for God's purpose. With whom will disciples praise God? Disciples will praise God alone or at times with family members. Which God will disciples praise? Disciples will praise the true God they believe in. How will disciples praise God? Disciples will praise God through prayers or through singing hymns. Let's go to the fourth one. What are disciples doing? Disciples are praising God. Where are disciples praising God? Disciples are praising God everywhere. When are disciples praising God? Disciples are praising God always. Why are disciples praising God? Disciples are praising God for everything that He has been giving them. Who is praising God? Disciples are praising God. For whose purpose are disciples praising God? Disciples are praising God for God's purpose. With whom are disciples praising God? Disciples are praising God alone or sometimes with family members. Which God are disciples praising? Disciples are praising the God they are believing in. How are disciples praising God? Disciples are praising God through prayers and through singing hymns. Let's go to the fifth one. What were disciples doing? Disciples were praising God. Where were disciples praising God? Disciples were praising God everywhere. When were disciples praising God? Disciples were praising God Disciples were praising God always. Why were disciples praising God? Disciples were praising God for getting everything from Him. Okay, who were praising God? Disciples were praising God. For whose purpose were disciples praising God? Disciples were praising God for God's purpose. With whom were disciples praising God? Disciples were praising God alone or at times with family members. Which God were disciples praising? Disciples were praising the God they were believing in. How were disciples praising God? Disciples were praising God through prayers or through singing hymns. Now let's go to the sixth one. What will disciples be doing? Disciples will be praising God. Where will disciples be praising God? Disciples will be praising God everywhere. When will disciples be praising God? Disciples will be praising God always. Why will disciples be praising God? Disciples will be praising God for things that He will be giving them. Who will be praising God? Disciples will be praising God. For whose purpose will disciples be praising God? Disciples will be praising God for God's purpose. With whom will disciples be praising? Disciples will be praising sometimes alone or sometimes with family members. Which God will disciples be praising? Disciples will be praising the God they will be believing in. How will disciples be praising God? Disciples will be praising God through prayers or through singing hymns. Now let's come to the seventh one. What have disciples done? Disciples have praised God. Okay, where had disciples praised God? Disciples had praised God everywhere. When have disciples praised God? Disciples have praised God always. Why have disciples praised God? Disciples have praised God for everything He has given them. Who has praised God? Disciples have praised God. For whose purpose have disciples praised God? Disciples have praised God for God's purpose. With whom have disciples praised God? Disciples have praised God alone or at times with family members. Which God have disciples praised? Disciples have praised Disciples have praised the God they have believed in. How have disciples praised God? Disciples have praised God through prayers or through singing hymns. Now, 8th one. What had disciples done? Disciples had praised God. Where had disciples praised God? Disciples had praised God everywhere. When had disciples praised God? Disciples had praised God always. Why had disciples praised God? Disciples had praised God for the things that He had given them. Who had praised God? Disciples had praised God. For whose purpose had disciples praised God? Disciples had praised God for God's purpose. With whom had disciples praised God? Disciples had praised God sometimes alone or sometimes with family members. Which God had disciples praised? Disciples had praised the God they had believed in. How had disciples praised God? Disciples had praised God through prayers and singing hymns. Let's go to the 9th one. What will disciples have done? Disciples will have prayed to God. Where will disciples have prayed to God? Disciples will have prayed to God everywhere. When will disciples have praised God? Disciples will have praised God always. Why will disciples have praised God? Disciples will have praised God for everything God will have given them. Who will have praised God? Disciples will have praised God. For whose purpose will disciples have praised God? Disciples will have praised God for God's purpose. With whom will have disciples praised God? Disciples will have praised God for God's purpose. Which God will disciples have praised? Disciples will have praised the God that they will have believed in. How will disciples have praised God? Disciples will have praised God through prayers and singing hymns. Let's go to the 7th one. Okay. Let's go to the 9th one. Not even 9th, 10th. Okay. What have disciples been doing? Disciples have been praising God. Where have disciples been praising God? Disciples have been praising God everywhere. When have disciples been praising God? Disciples have been praising God always. Why have disciples been praising God? Disciples have been praising God for the things that they have been getting from Him. Who has been praising God? Disciples have been praising God. For whose purpose have disciples been praising God? Disciples have been praising God for God's purpose. With whom have disciples been praising God? Disciples have been praising God, sometimes alone and at times with family members. Which God have disciples been praising? Disciples have been praising God, the God that they have believed in. How have disciples been praising God? Disciples have been praising God through prayers and singing hymns. Let's go to the 11th one. What had disciples been doing? Disciples had been praising God. Where had disciples been praising God? Disciples had been praising God everywhere. When had disciples been praising God? Disciples had been praising God always. Why had disciples been praising God? Disciples had been praising God for everything He had given them. Who had been praising God? Disciples had been praising God. For whose purpose had disciples been praising God? Disciples had been praising God for God's purpose. With whom had disciples been praising God? Disciples had been praising God alone or at times with family members. Which God had disciples been praising? Disciples had been praising the God they had been believing in. How had disciples been praising God? Disciples had been praising God through prayers and singing hymns. Now coming to the last one. What will disciples have been doing? Disciples will have been praising God. Where will disciples have been praising God? Disciples will have been praising God everywhere. When will disciples have been praising God? Disciples will have been praising God always. Why will disciples have been praising God? Disciples will have been praising God for everything that He will have been giving them. Who will have been praising God? Disciples will have been praising God. For whose purpose will disciples have been praising God? Disciples will have been praising God for God's purpose. With whom will disciples have been praising God? Disciples will have been praising God alone or at times with family members. Which God will disciples have been praising? Disciples will have been praising God, the God they will have believed in. How will disciples have been praising God? Disciples will have been praising God through prayers or through singing hymns. Like I told you in the beginning, don't worry about the inner meaning. Worry about the technicality about framing sentences. So this is the correct way of framing sentence WH questions, and this is the correct way of answering to these WH questions. If you can just keep practicing them, I assure you that you will be speaking definitely fluent English. You can easily ask WH questions, or if someone asks you some WH questions, you can easily answer them in any tense. So what I recommend you is to keep practicing more and more of these WH questions and more and more of these sentences. You'll be getting different kinds of sentences, and I advise you to click on them and keep practicing along with me. You will be increasing your vocabulary. You will be increasing your accent, neutral accent. I wish you all the best.